Hello Internet, welcome to the channel. My name's Frankie and in this video we are going to be building a lovely forest habitat for the Siberian tiger. The starting point for this habitat is to build a viewing gallery. Now, as I have done with the past few habitats, I'm going to build a little bit of a path that juts out from the main one to separate the people from the main, crowds, because otherwise the main paths are going to become really busy if the viewing galleries are linked directly to them. Now, to build the viewing gallery, I use some of the large window pieces, which are basically just squares with another square inside that you can then fill with glass. I'm going to use 4 of those with a plain dry stone wall piece in the center. As these animals come from East Asia, we're going to be using pieces from the East Asia theme pack just to kind of, obviously fit that theme. We're going to use a dry stone wall piece in the middle and then place an education board on that. And I'm also going to use one of the East Asian themed frames that you will find under the window section in the building tab. I'm going to use that just to add a bit of character to the education board, because otherwise it can look a bit plain. Here you can see me playing about with various signs and stuff, and in the end I just decided not to use any here. We're going to make the front of this viewing gallery be more about kind of introducing people to what animal is in here rather than this bit. This will just be where the education board's going to go. I am quite happy that I found these posters though. They are actually for the Bengal tiger, but I think they are going to work for the Siberian tiger regardless, so whilst I don't keep them here, I do use them later. The basic premise for this viewing gallery was to create a structure that kind of follows this path that we've just set out. This little bit that shoots off from our main path, we want it to wrap around that. And to do that, we are just going to use these building pieces from the East Asia pack, and we're basically going to be creating a massive C kind of shape, as in the letter C. And I sketch out the whole area using the dry stone wall floor pieces. I just cover the entire area that I want to be covered with those, and then I will follow round with the roof pieces and the wall pieces afterwards. When I was actually placing the tiles on top, that is when I made the decision to have it be slightly smaller than what I'd first planned. As you can see, the floor pieces are, they cover more area than the tiles do, but I thought that this shape, this irregular shape that the tiles had created, was a little more fun, so I decided to cut out that centerpiece, and it works quite nicely because then you have this area that you can fill with decoration and stuff to really introduce people to what is going to be in this habitat, which will work really quite nicely, I think. Yeah, we're going to come back with some dry stone wall pieces. I decided to use some curved ones on the corners just because I don't often use the curved ones, but unfortunately for some reason on this grid they would not snap to be in line with the walls, so I decided to just create a separate grid to do that, and then I can use that grid to add the other walls and stuff and just complete this building. At the very front of the viewing gallery, where the viewing gallery meets the path, the 4x4 pieces would actually encroach on the path. So I decided to use the L-shaped pieces, and that'll bring it quite close to the edge of the path, whilst allowing me to not go over it entirely. However, that does then mean that the structure is kind of floating, which doesn't work too well. So what I decided to do is use some large wooden logs or beams. Actually, I think they're called pillars, specifically from the East Asia pack, like the rest of this building is, and then just prop those up underneath the overhanging roof pieces and that L-shaped kind of blockwork there as well, just to add a little bit of structure, make it seem like this thing isn't floating, but instead it is supported. It's not going to fall on you as you walk underneath it, because that would be very unfortunate, and I have a feeling that our zoo may have to pay quite a hefty price if a building just collapses on our guests. Yeah, that wouldn't be great, would it? With the basic structure of the viewing gallery complete, it's time to start decorating, and the first thing that I'm going to do is to sink some red wooden beams into the wall where the education board is, and that's just to break it up a little bit. Having these massive windows next to it really highlights how plain this wall is, so just adding those red painted wooden planks to the wall, it just spices it up a little bit. I quite like it. Then I'm going to go over to the hanging lights section, and I'm going to choose 2 little lanterns and put those either side of the viewing gallery to make sure that this area is lit, as it is undercover, so it might get a little bit dark. And once I'm happy with the lighting, I then move on to using some decorative posters or like wall art. Yeah, I'd describe it as wall art. It's 4 different images that link together to create one big flowing images of a few cranes flying amongst some trees. And it is lovely. I really, really like this. And to begin with, I didn't realise they went together, because for some reason, the way that they are ordered in the building pieces is not the order they should be put in order to create a cohesive image. So that's a bit confusing. It did take a bit of playing about for me to realise what I was actually doing. I create 2 sets of 4 of these posters, and then I have them either end of this central area in the viewing gallery, just to add a little bit of colour inside. I know that the guests are primarily going to be looking at the animals, obviously, but it's quite nice to have a bit of colour on the walls and stuff, something a bit more interesting to look at as well, rather than just the animals. A bit more interesting was the wrong word. Obviously, these paintings aren't more interesting than a bloody tiger. Come on. But you know what I mean. Just something else to look at whilst you're in this viewing gallery. Up until this point in my zoo, the main way that people have been getting any education has been through either conservation boards, which are dotted around the zoo, the education boards for each animal, or a few select keeper talks. Well, not keeper talks, but the educators that come out and do talks about the animals. So I decided I wanted to use some of the child-friendly, the ones that are kind of directed at children. Wanted to use a couple of those education systems right at the front of this tiger habitat. So I thought I'd go for the one that looks like the mouth of a carnivore and a paw print of a large cat or dog or something like that. I thought that those were quite appropriate for this space. Now, after having a little look through our statues, I did find that we have a Siberian Tiger statue, which is pretty lucky, I think. It's spot on. Not this massive head. As much as I think it would have been funny to pop this on top of the building, I don't think it's very appropriate. But yeah, we do actually have a Siberian Tiger statue, one of the unlockables from career mode. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some faux rocks to create a little space for this guy to stand on, to make it look like he's leaping from one rock to the other. And rather than making them white like I have in most of the other areas of this winter wonderland portion of my zoo, I'm going to make them a grey colour instead, just so that they kind of blend in a little bit to this viewing gallery and don't stand out too much, whereas the tiger itself, the statue of the tiger, is really light, so it will stand out a little bit more, which is great because that's what we want our guests to be looking at. After that, there is nothing habitat specific to do for this viewing gallery. It's just a matter of grabbing our donation bins, our waste bins and benches, littering them around this area just to decorate it a little bit and make it be a bit more user friendly. I say user, but you know, the guests, I mean. The kind of essentials for them: somewhere to sit, somewhere to plop their rubbish, and if they want to donate to these wonderful tigers, somewhere to drop their cash. And with the viewing gallery being done, the next step is to establish a perimeter for the habitat, and then we can move on to making a habitat house. And for once I want to actually make something that you would see in a zoo in terms of habitat house. I don't have the number of decorations that I would necessarily want for doing a nice realistic backstage area. I'm waiting for the conservation pack really to get a lot of detail oriented pieces, like I know they have shovels and spades and like pitchforks and stuff, and they will be really useful for making it look like a realistic backstage area. But for now, what I'm going to do is just use the rocky kind of habitat barrier, sketch out an area that I am kind of happy with, and to begin with it's a bit too square, and I decided to cut out a corner so that I can actually place our building, and I will wrap the barrier around that instead of trying to squeeze that into a pre-existing barrier. When I started building this habitat house, I didn't actually plan to just use East Asia pieces. I thought I'd muck about and use a few different ones instead, just because this isn't really going to be seen by the guests. But in the end, I do actually end up using things only from the East Asia theme. I did play about with the idea of using the mud wall pieces to begin with, because I thought that could be kind of cool for blending the ground, making it look like it is made of mud for the animals. But I didn't really like how they overlap, they don't look too good. So what I ended up using is these stone wall brick pieces, which are large square kind of stones that are used to make it kind of looks like a kitchen floor, in my opinion. If they were black and white, then this would make a perfect traditional kitchen. I decided to make it 3 rows of these 4x4 pieces. We're going to have 2 be the width of 2 is going to be a sleeping area for the animals, and then that third building piece will be where the staff path is and where the keepers are able to access our habitat house. To separate those 2 areas, I'm going to use the 4-meter mesh fence pieces, and I'm just going to run that the length of the building and then create one dividing piece in the middle, kind of like a large T shape, like the capital letter T, and this will create 2 separate sleeping areas. And my reason for doing this is because tigers, when in captivity like this, are normally kept apart. You will normally have a zoo would normally have 1 male and 1 female, and they would normally be kept in separate enclosures and only ever really brought together for mating purposes, which is why you can quite often see them kind of just pacing up and down the side of a fence, following each other. That's mainly because they're kind of wanting to mate, but they're being kept apart at the moment. So yeah, so that's the idea here. Although we're not actually going to be keeping these tigers separate, and the habitat itself won't reflect that, I thought it was kind of a fun idea to make the habitat house reflect that, how they are actually kept in captivity. I just thought it was a little fun thing to do. Now, the inside of this building does not get any fancier. This is basically it. We're going to add a couple lights to the wall just because it is pitch black in there, and that's not very useful for the keepers at least. But yeah, the wall pieces are going to be the same material as the floor, the stone brick wall. It's primarily just going to be the 4x4, except at the front we're just going to leave one area free, which is where the animals are going to get through. So each half of this habitat house is going to have a large gap that is going to be capped with a 1 meter thick kind of lintel at the top, just to kind of support the roof, because otherwise it's like freestanding, which is obviously not very realistic. As you can see, the fencing does ever so slightly clip outside of the walls, so that's going to need adjusting a little bit, and to do that I just select all of it and then use the advanced move tools. However, it is slightly wider than the actual building, so I'm going to need to adjust a single panel as well rather than just all of them. And I'm just going to use the advanced move tools again to just shuffle it in a little bit. It does create a bit of an overlap, but I don't really care, to be honest. I think it still looks pretty good. It's a small detail to just get over. So with that, I'm going to move it into its position, and then I can start to add the roof. And for the roof, I'm going to use the East Asia tile, the terracotta looking tiles, and I'm just going to create a very simple roof structure. I do have to adjust the perimeter of the habitat just because my staff path isn't working as I thought it would, which is completely fine. I'm going to lay that just underneath the floor pieces that we've added to this habitat house, and that will allow the path to basically be invisible, but the keepers will still be able to use it and come through this area whilst looking like they are just walking on the actual floor pieces that we put in place, which is much better, and how you would create a custom path. If you want to create a custom path, lay down your floor pieces that you want to be using and then add a path underneath it, just like what I'm doing here, and that will allow you to have a custom path around your entire zoo if you wanted, which is pretty fun if that's the kind of thing you want to do. But for me personally, it's not, it's too much work. With the building and staff path in place, I can start to finish wrapping up the habitat barrier, and I'm just going to continue with the gabion piece, and then when I get to the habitat house, I'm going to switch to a null barrier, and this is one that is invisible, which means it will kind of, basically what it does is if you lay this barrier outside of an object that you have placed, the object itself will act as the barrier because it will be keeping your animals in. As long as the animal doesn't cross this null barrier that you've placed, they will register as being in their habitat, and you can place a habitat barrier door or gate on this null barrier as well, which means you can add doors to custom buildings like this. As I said, the roof is constructed out of the terracotta roof tiles, and as the habitat barrier gate is inside this habitat house, the building itself doesn't actually have a doorway, well, at least not a functioning one. And to kind of remedy that, I'm not going to bother adding a wall piece with a door hole in it, because the doors never seem to fit that, which is really quite annoying. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our building material area, go over to the door section, and with the East Asia theme applied, I'm just going to pick one of the doors from there and kind of just push it onto the wall. It's not a functioning one, it's just a decoration, but the keepers will just walk through it because they're magicians, so they just walk through walls. Or either that or they're mutants. Maybe they're all, is it Kitty Pryde that can do that from X-Men? Yeah, who knows? I'd also like to point out that at the front in the viewing gallery we ran a glass barrier through those windows and just adjust it to reach the top so that it kind of fills those window frames. And with that viewing gallery done, and the perimeter of the habitat done, and the habitat house done, we can actually move on to introducing our animals and making this habitat a paradise for them. The first thing that I want to do to make this habitat a bit more immersive is to make the habitat house kind of disappear, at least from where the viewing gallery is. The guests won't be able to see it as a habitat house, and the animals will see it as being quite a bit more natural as well. And to do that, I'm going to use various aquatic faux rock pieces to make this look like a cave entrance. We're going to use the arches over the two doorway areas, and then we're just going to use various size rocks to cover up the block work, this wall, because at the moment it looks way too man-made. So we're just going to use various rocks to cover all that up, and I'm not actually going to change the colour. I did play about with the idea of changing them later, but in the end I think this colour actually looks completely fine in this habitat, so I end up leaving it as is. It's also worth noting that I don't really care that it's clipping through the roof. I did try to make it neat and tidy, but in the end it just doesn't work that way. So I'm not too bothered about it clipping through the roof, because once the animals are in here, the traversable area just doesn't work. They can't get out of this building. So whilst it looks nice and neat now, I'm just going to have to mess it up later, so it doesn't really matter. Inside, I'm going to lay loads of hay down on the floor just to complete their inside sleeping area, and then we can move on to digging a water hole for these animals. As you know, I like to use natural water sources, so I'm going to create a large flowing area that goes from basically one corner of the habitat to the other. We're starting with our deepest area, and well, I say deepest area, we're going to carve the whole thing out using this deepest level with a flattened terrain tool, and then we're going to go around the edges at a slightly higher height to create a shallower area, and then we'll use the smooth tool to smooth it all out. And this is obviously way too big, this first attempt. There's way too much space for the water, so I'll just cut back in, adding more earth and stuff until I am happy with the shape of this watering hole. And as we know, tigers love to have a good swim, so it is kind of important that we have lots of space for them to splash about and have a lovely drink. Once I am happy with the shape of the watering hole, I am going to add some faux rocks to create a platform and start to build a climbing area for these animals. Tigers do love to climb about, and whenever I see them at zoos, they do have a risen platform, somewhere to climb up to and sleep about and just watch the guests kind of looking at them like, yeah, I'm not going to perform for you, I'm just going to sleep. At least that's the impression I always get from tigers in captivity. It's quite funny. So yeah, I'm just going to use the faux rocks to create a big platform, and from there I'm going to use various climbing pieces to create a small structure for these animals to climb about on. There's not much more to say on that, so I'm just going to pop this little bit in time lapse and I'll be back in a second to talk more. And with the arrival of our first Siberian Tiger, I believe this one is the male, we can start to make the terrain distribution changes and the foliage changes that are needed. But more importantly than that is checking the hitbox, or sorry, the traversable area, and realizing they can't actually get out of their habitat house. So as I said earlier, I have to move these rocks about quite a bit. It's basically just raising these archways. They were ultimately too low, meaning that there wasn't quite as much space. As soon as I do that, they can get out, which is completely fine. So it does make for a bit more of an untidy finish, but the animals can actually get out and use their habitat house, so it's worth doing. To meet the terrain distribution requirements, the main thing that I'm going to do is sink a couple coolers into the floor and then just cover this area in snow, because we are in the Winter Wonderland section of our zoo, so obviously we want a bunch of snow. But I'm then going to come back and use some soil and rock and stuff just to break up the blanket of white. And, well, not only that, they do actually want that ranging ground texture, so I'm also meeting their needs. Next, it's time to litter this habitat with enrichment items and food trays. We want to make sure that these animals are going to be using up their entire habitat. So as always, we're going to space out our enrichment items and make sure they're going to be traveling all over their habitat. And as we've got such a lovely viewing gallery right at the front, I'm going to place our large food tray right in front of that. Something I didn't mention earlier is that the idea of making that viewing gallery, rather than having a large portion of this habitat be just like a wall that you can see over, I thought it'd be better to have a more intimate and private feeling viewing gallery, because these animals do kind of like that. They are not very bold. Well, they are bold. I mean, look at them. But I mean, they're quite secretive animals. They like to hide in the forests and stuff. They're not coming out and just waving at people, are they? So they need their privacy. So I thought to have a bit more of a hidden viewing gallery like that would kind of be appropriate. Now onto the best part of any habitat build, and that is to add all the foliage. And for this one, I decided to stick to one type of tree, and that is the old Scott pine. I just kind of really like these trees, and I'm always using the dead or broken Scott pine trees. I never actually used the living ones, so I thought it'd be good to use those. I'm basically only going to be sticking to these. I do end up adding a second one. I think it's olive trees, just little olive trees spotted around the habitat. I'm really going for the coniferous and scrub forests that these animals actually live in. I want this to be really dense and quite difficult to see through. At the end of the day, the guests are kind of second to the animals, in my opinion anyway. We should always be focusing on animals having the best life they can rather than the guests. So if the guests can't see the tiger, oh well, the tiger's living its best life that it can do in captivity. So that is what we're aiming for here. So yeah, a few trees scattered around the entire habitat, and then I'm going to do my fairly common, now I do it in most of my habitats, trick of just creating kind of a stamp of various ground covering plants. I'm going to be using some caribou moss and some bracken and brambles. Just going to create a small little template that we can then copy and paste around the entire habitat, focusing mainly at the base of trees where the leaf litter and stuff will have enriched that soil, made it a bit more nutrient rich, therefore growing a few more plants at the base of these trees. I'll then come back afterwards and add a few more kind of highlight flowers and stuff, just things that break up the monotonous green ground covering. We're just going to break it up with a few flowers and stuff. But yeah, now that you know my basic ideas behind why I'm placing what I'm placing, I'm going to stop talking and let you enjoy. Thank you so much for having watched this video and for having made it all the way to the end of the video. If you did enjoy it, please consider giving it a thumbs up and maybe subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this appearing in your subscription feed. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.